It all happened so fast. One minute I was driving home from work, feeling the weight of another exhausting day pressing down on me, and the next thing I knew, everything went black. I remember the screech of tires, the crashing of metal, and then nothing. It was like the world just stopped. The next thing I remember, I was floating. No pain, no fear, just a sense of disconnection, like I was suspended somewhere between life and death. I could feel my body, but it didn't feel real anymore. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if the world had faded away, leaving me in a void, a place where I didn't belong. The first sign that something wasn't right came when I started to feel the temperature rising. It was subtle at first, like stepping out into a hot summer day, but then it kept getting worse, unbearable. I could feel the heat seeping through my skin, curling in the pit of my stomach. I started to sense that I was no longer in control of my own body. There was something pulling me, dragging me downward. The air became thick, heavy, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even pray. As I continued to descend, the surroundings began to take shape. The darkness was overwhelming. I couldn't see anything at first, just the oppressive blackness. But slowly, shadows began to emerge. Figures, dark, twisted shapes, started to form around me. There were no faces, just outlines of beings that seemed to be watching me. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence, like they were waiting for something. My heart pounded harder with every passing moment. The heat intensified, becoming more suffocating, pressing against my chest, and I felt like I was being smothered. The ground beneath me began to harden, and I found myself moving through a series of stone corridors, narrow and cold with no way out. I wasn't walking. It was more like I was being dragged, pulled by invisible hands. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like eternity. Every step forward felt like an eternity in itself. The deeper I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. There was something about it, something that made every breath feel like a battle, every moment more intense than the last. The worst part was the silence. The air was thick with it, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own heart. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like it was crushing my soul. A silence that made me realize just how alone I was. I thought about the people I loved, the things I had left behind, but no matter how hard I tried to think of anything else, I was trapped in this suffocating place. Then I saw them. The creatures, if you could even call them that, two shadowy figures, hunched and grotesque, appeared before me. They didn't speak, but somehow I knew they were guiding me. They didn't seem to care about me. They weren't there to comfort me or help me. They were just there, silent, cold. They nudged me forward, pushing me deeper into the darkness, towards something I couldn't see. I tried to look around to find any hint of light, any escape, but there was nothing. Just the same unyielding blackness and heat. We continued moving through this dreadful place until we reached a large, cavernous room. The heat was unbearable now, a physical force pressing against me from all sides. It was so intense that I thought I might collapse from the sheer pressure of it. My head was spinning, and I felt like I was going to suffocate any second. As we moved further into the chamber, I finally saw what was at the center, a figure. A man bound in chains, his body twisted and contorted, groaning in pain. His face was pale and twisted with agony, and there was no mistaking it. This man was suffering. My heart stopped as I recognized him. It was Reinhard Bonnke. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was the man who had been my spiritual hero, the one I had looked up to for so long, the one who had promised healing, salvation, and miracles in the name of God. He was the man who had helped me believe in the power of God's love. But here he was, not the mighty evangelist I had seen on TV, not the charismatic preacher who healed thousands in Jesus' name. No, here he was, broken, chained, and suffering. I couldn't understand it. How could this be? How could the man who had preached God's power, who had promised healing and salvation, be here in this place of torment? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I wanted to scream, to ask questions, to understand what had gone wrong, but I couldn't speak. The heat, the pressure, the silence, it all made my head spin. I felt like I was being crushed under the weight of it all. How could this have happened to him? How could this man, this great preacher of faith, end up here? It was in that moment of overwhelming confusion and fear that I heard a voice. Low, broken, but unmistakable. It was Reinhard Bonnke, speaking to me from the depths of his pain. "Michael," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "You don't understand, but I'll explain. This is the result of my own mistakes. The mistakes I made by focusing too much on miracles and not enough on God's grace." His words sent a chill down my spine. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there, staring at him in disbelief. The heat, the darkness, the oppressive silence, it all seemed to fade into the background as I listened to the broken man who had once been my guide, my inspiration, now confessing his own failings. I couldn't grasp what was happening, but one thing was certain. This was a place I never imagined I would find myself. A place where the lines between faith, failure, and redemption blurred beyond recognition. And I knew that my journey had just begun. I stood frozen in shock, my heart racing as I looked at Reinhard Bonnke, the man who had once been my spiritual hero. The sight of him chained and suffering in the flames was almost too much to bear. This was the man who had inspired me to follow Jesus with all my heart, who had preached of miracles and divine healing, and yet here he was, bound in torment, in the very place he had warned others to avoid. I felt a mix of disbelief and terror. How could this be? How could someone who had led so many people to Christ, who had spoken of God's miracles and promises, end up in hell? The room seemed to close in around me as I tried to make sense of it. Every part of me screamed out in confusion, desperate for an explanation. But there was no escaping the grim reality in front of me. Bonnke, once a figure of hope, was now a shadow of his former self, his face etched with pain and regret. And then, through the darkness and the heat, I heard his voice. It was strained, but there was a kind of sorrow in it that I couldn't ignore. "Michael, you don't understand yet, but you will," he said, his words heavy with the weight of his own suffering. I was wrong. I preached about healing, about miracles, but I failed to truly understand what it means to walk in humility before God. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the triumphant preacher I had seen on television. This was a broken man, humbled by the consequences of his own actions. I wanted to ask him why, how this could happen to someone who had done so much in the name of God, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just stood there, paralyzed by the truth of his situation. As I looked into his eyes, I realized that he wasn't just a preacher in torment. He was a warning. His suffering wasn't just physical, it was a deep spiritual agony, a result of the choices he had made, of the ways he had misused the very gifts and faith he had preached about. It became clear that this was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a painful lesson, one that I was now being forced to witness. Bonnke's voice trembled as he spoke again, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that I couldn't look away from. The chains that bound him seemed almost like a reflection of the guilt he carried, and the pain in his voice was something I will never forget. "Michael, I was not who you thought I was," he began, his words coming slowly, as if each one caused him anguish. "I preached the power of healing, the glory of God's miracles, but somewhere along the way, I lost the truth. I began to believe that I had power, that I was the one doing these things, not God. It became about the crowd, about the fame, about the donations. It became about me." I could feel my stomach twist as he continued. This was not the man I had admired for so long. It was someone who had once stood in the light of God, but whose heart had strayed into darkness. "I told people that their faith would be rewarded if they gave enough, that healing would come if they just believed hard enough. But what I failed to see was that I was turning the gospel into a transaction. Bonnke confessed, his voice breaking with regret. Faith is not about buying miracles. God's grace cannot be bought, Michael. And yet, I manipulated that very grace for personal gain. I promised healing, but the only healing I sought was for my own ego. His words were like arrows piercing through the illusion I had built around him. I wanted to cry out, to defend the image of the powerful preacher who had touched so many lives, including mine. But I knew deep down that he was speaking the truth. Do you know what I failed to understand, Michael? He paused, looking at me with eyes full of regret. It's not about miracles. It's not about what you can do for God. It's about what God has done for you. His love, His grace, they are the only things that matter. But I lost that. I became obsessed with my own success and the power I wielded in His name. The weight of His words crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I could hardly process it. The man I had trusted, the man I had followed, had fallen because he had forgotten the one simple truth that all Christians must know, that salvation and grace are gifts freely given by God. They are not for sale. I realize now that Bonke's ministry, for all the good it may have done, had been built on the wrong foundation, the foundation of asterisk self. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. Don't make the same mistake I did, Michael. Don't let your faith be about what you can get from God. Let it be about what you can give, and more importantly, about what He has already given to you. Bonnke's gaze softened as he continued to speak, his voice quieter now, but still filled with a profound sadness. It was as if, even in the depths of hell, he had come to understand something that had eluded him throughout his ministry. The way he spoke about faith had changed. The fire of his past zeal was now tempered by a humility I had never imagined he possessed. Michael, I thought healing was something I could give people, he began, his voice cracking. I thought that by laying my hands on them, by preaching the right words, by calling down fire from heaven, that I could make them whole. But I was wrong. Healing is not about me. It's about God's will, His grace, and His mercy. Healing comes from His love, not from our efforts to control it. His words hit me like a thunderclap. For all the times I had watched his crusades on television, believing that healing was a result of faith in his ministry, I had missed the point entirely. I had misunderstood the very nature of faith itself. You see, Bonnke went on, his eyes becoming distant, as though he was reliving his past failures. I told people that if they believed hard enough, they would be healed. I preached that their salvation depended on the strength of their faith, but faith is not a currency. You cannot buy a miracle. You cannot demand it. True faith is surrender. It is trusting God even when He doesn't give you what you ask for. It's accepting His will, even when it doesn't match your expectations. I could hardly breathe as he spoke, his words cutting through the illusions I had built around the faith I thought I understood. For all the years I had chased after signs and wonders, I had never truly surrendered to God's will. I had sought the miracles, the healing, the answers, but I had never asked God, "What do you want from me?" There is no such thing as a transactional faith, Bonnke continued. If you give money or time or service, expecting God to reward you in kind, you're missing the point. It's not about us earning God's favor. It's about humbling ourselves before Him, accepting His grace in whatever form it comes. I sat there stunned as the weight of His words pressed in on me. My entire understanding of faith had been so incomplete, so misdirected. I had always thought that miracles were a sign of God's favor, something I could attain by doing the right things. But now I saw the truth. True faith was not about gaining something from God. It was about trusting Him, no matter what, and surrendering to His perfect plan. You see, Michael, he said, his voice softer now, in the end, the only thing that matters is whether or not we trust God with our whole lives, not with our money, not with our time, not with our efforts, but with everything. Because in the end, that's the only thing we can offer Him, our hearts. And in return, He gives us the grace to accept whatever He chooses to give us. As he finished speaking, a profound peace settled over me. I understood now, in a way I never had before, that true healing wasn't about getting something from God. It was about surrendering to Him fully, trusting that His plan for me was better than anything I could imagine. It was about resting in His love and accepting His grace, regardless of the circumstances. Bonke's chains no longer seemed to weigh him down, and I felt the burden of my own misunderstandings begin to lift. For the first time, I understood the essence of faith. Not the pursuit of signs, not the demand for miracles, but a heart fully surrendered to God's will. A heart that knows that even in the darkest places, He is still good. He is still faithful. And that, I now realized, is the true healing. Suddenly, as if a great force had jolted me back to life, I felt a sharp intake of breath, the air rushing into my lungs like a flood. My eyes snapped open, and I was no longer in that dark, suffocating place. I was lying on a cold, sterile hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of medical equipment. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind racing to process what had just happened. I tried to sit up, but my body ached, and I realized I was hooked up to an IV. My chest felt heavy. My head spun as I struggled to make sense of the situation. My hands trembled, and a sense of disbelief washed over me. How was I here? Had I really been in hell, speaking to Reinhard Bonnke just moments ago? It felt like a dream, a vivid, life-altering dream, but the pain in my body told me that it was real. A nurse entered the room, checking the monitors and adjusting my IV. "You're awake. You've been through quite a traumatic experience, car accident, but you're going to be all right. You've been unconscious for several hours, but your vitals are stabilizing now." Car accident. That's right. I remembered the crash, the screeching tires, the impact, the sense of falling, and then nothing. But everything else? It felt like a lifetime. The encounter with Reinhard Bonnke, the lessons he had taught me, the profound transformation I felt within myself, it all flooded my mind, and I knew that something had fundamentally changed in me. I couldn't explain it fully, but I knew that my life, in every sense, had been altered. As I lay back against the pillows, I remembered the words Bonke had spoken, the lesson on true faith, the healing that comes not from seeking miracles, but from surrendering to God's will. I had spent so much of my life chasing after signs, believing that faith meant demanding answers, that miracles were rewards for good behavior. But now I understood. True faith is about letting go of control, trusting in God no matter what, and accepting His will, even when it defies understanding. A profound peace settled over me, a calm that didn't come from the hospital room but from deep within. I wasn't sure if it was a miracle, but something had shifted in me, and I could feel it. God's presence, His grace, His love, more real and more tangible than ever before. As I closed my eyes for a moment, I prayed quietly, thanking God for bringing me back. I didn't know how long I had left in this life, but I knew one thing for sure. I would live it differently. I would live it for Him. I wouldn't chase after the empty promises of the world or even the empty promises of miracles. I would seek His love, His truth, and His will above all else. When I opened my eyes again, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't the same man who had walked into that car crash. I had been given a second chance, and with it, the opportunity to truly surrender my life to God. As I left the hospital later that day, I knew that my journey was just beginning, but I was no longer afraid. I had seen the truth.